as a group because of their close anatomic relationship to the brainstem and to one another. So the tendency to be involved together, so they tend to be involved together in a variety of disease states. 9 out of 12 cranial nerves connect directly with the brainstem, except for cranial nerve 1. Cranial nerve 1, your olfactory, and your cranial nerve 2, your optic motor, are more accurately considered the fiber tracts of the brain. And also the cranial nerve 11, or your spinal accessory nerves, whose motor neurons reside largely in the upper cervical cord. So signs and symptoms of cranial nerve pathology are common, and they often develop in the context of a widespread neurologic disturbance. And in such situations, cranial nerve involvement may represent the initial manifestation of the illness. So let's start with facial pain or numbness. So to review the anatomy, the trigeminal nerve, or your fifth cranial nerve, supplies the sensation to the skin of the face and the anterior half of the head, and the nasal and oral mucosa. So the motor part innervates the muscles involved in chewing, including the masseters and the pterygoids, as well as the anterior belly of the digastric, the mylohyoid, the tensor villi palatini, and the tensor tympani of the middle ear. So the trigeminal nerve is the largest of the cranial nerves. And the nerve divides into 3 divisions, as you can see in the figure. So we have the ophthalmic, or your V1, the maxillary, your V2, and the mandibular nerve, or your V3. So V1 and V2 traverse the cavernous sinus to exit in the superior orbital fissure and the foramen rotundum, located above and below the eye socket, respectively, while the V3 exits through the foramen ovale. The trigeminal nerve is predominantly a sensory nerve, and motor innervation is exclusively carried in V3, or your mandibular nerve. The trigeminal nerve is also ensheathed by a oligodendrocyte-derived myelin for up to 7 millimeters after it leaves the brainstem. So unlike just a few millimeters for other cranial and spinal nerves. This may explain the high frequency of trigeminal neuralgia in multiple sclerosis patients, which I discussed yesterday. So for trigeminal neuralgia, or known as a tic douloureux, it is relatively common with an estimated annual incidence of 4 to 8 per 100,000 individuals, and middle-aged and elderly persons are affected primarily, with 60% of cases occur in women. For the pathophysiology, symptoms results from ectopic generation of action potentials in pain-sensitive afferent fibers of the fifth cranial nerve root just before it enters the lateral surface of the pons. So compression or other pathology in the nerve leads to demyelination of a large myelinated fibers that do not themselves carry pain sensation, but become hyperexcitable and electrically coupled with smaller unmyelinated or poorly myelinated pain fibers in the close proximity. So this may explain why tactile stimuli can stimulate paroxysms of pain. Compression of the trigeminal nerve root by a blood vessel, most often the superior cerebellar artery, or on occasion a tortuous vein, is now believed to be the source of trigeminal neuralgia in most patients. So in cases of vascular compression, age-related brain sagging, and increased vascular thickness and tortuosity may explain the prevalence of the trigeminal neuralgia in later life. So for the clinical manifestation, it is characterized by excruciating paroxysms of pain in the lips, gums, cheek, or chin, and very rarely in the distribution of the ophthalmic divisions of the fifth nerve. So the pain seldom lasts more than a few seconds or a minute or two, but may be so intense that the patient winces, hence the term tic. The paroxysms, experienced as single jabs or clusters, tend to recur frequently, both day and night, for several weeks at a time. The presence of trigger zones, typically on the face, lips, or tongue, that provoke attacks, such as tactile stimuli like washing the face, brushing the teeth, or exposure to draft air, which generate excruciating pain. And an essential feature of trigeminal neuralgia is that objective signs of sensory loss cannot be demonstrated on examination. The onset is typically sudden, and bouts tend to persist for weeks or months before remitting spontaneously. And the remission may be long lasting, but in most patients, the disorder ultimately recurs. So, trigeminal neuralgia must be distinguished from other causes of face and head pain, and from pain arising from the diseases of the jaw, teeth, and sinuses. So, the following differential diagnosis must be ruled out, such as pain from migraine or cluster headache tends to be deep-seated and steady, unlike the superficial stabbing quality of trigeminal neuralgia. Other rare headaches also include short-lasting unilateral headache attacks with conjunctival injection and tearing. Temporal arteritis, superficial pain is present but is not typically shock-like, and the patient frequently complains of myalgia and other systemic symptoms, also with elevated ESR and CRP. So when trigeminal neuralgia develops in a young adult or is bilateral, multiple sclerosis is a key consideration. Cases of secondary mass lesions such as aneurysms, neurofibromas, acoustic schwannomas, or meningiomas usually produce objective signs and sensory loss in a trigeminal nerve distribution. And unlike in trigeminal neuralgia, there is no objective sign. For laboratory evaluation, an ESR or CRP is indicated if temporal arteritis is suspected, while neuroimaging studies are usually unnecessary but may be valuable if MS is a consideration or in assessing overlying vascular lesions. Drug therapy with carbamazepine is effective in 50 to 75% of patients. So carbamazepine is an anticonvulsant which stabilizes inactivated state of sodium channels, thereby making neurons less excitable. It should be started as 100 milligrams per day in divided doses, taken with food and increased gradually every 1 to 2 days until a substantial pain relief is achieved. Most patients require a maintenance dose of 200 milligrams 4 times a day. And most important side effects are dizziness, imbalance, sedation, and a rare case of agranulocytosis. If the treatment is effective, it is usually continued for 1 month and then tapered as tolerated. Another drug is oxcarbamazepine, given at 300 to 1,200 milligrams 2 times a day. An alternative to carbamazepine, which has less bone marrow toxicity, but it is probably less efficacious. So if these agents are not well tolerated or are ineffective, we may also give lamotrigine, phenytoin, or baclofen may be tried. Gabapentin may also be given for occasional pain relief. Okay, let's proceed. So if drug treatment fails, surgical therapy should be offered. And the most widely used method is currently the microvascular decompression to relieve the pressure on the trigeminal nerve. So the procedure requires a suboccipital craniotomy. So what is a craniotomy? It is a surgical removal of a part of the bone from the skull to expose the brain. So this procedure appears to have more than 70% efficacy rate and a low rate of recurrence in the responders. And the response is better for the classic tick-like symptoms. High-resolution magnetic resonance angiography is useful preoperatively to visualize the relationships between the fifth cranial nerve root and the nearby blood vessels. So as you can see in the picture, that is the procedure requires for suboccipital craniotomy. That is the incision site. Next procedure is the gamma knife radiosurgery of the trigeminal nerve roots, which is also used and results in a complete pain relief with sometimes delayed in onset with a low risk of persistent facial numbness. And recurrent pain develops over 2 to 3 years in half of these patients. However, compared with surgical decompression, gamma knife surgery appears to be somewhat less effective but has a few serious complications. So this is a picture of how gamma knife radiosurgery is done. Okay. So another procedure is the radiofrequency thermal rhizotomy, which creates a heat lesion of the trigeminal ganglion or the nerve. So it has short-term relief by more than 95% of patients. However, pain recurs in up to one-third of treated patients. Complications are partial numbness of the face, masseter weakness, corneal denervation with secondary keratitis. So again, this is a picture of how radiofrequency thermal rhizotomy is done. An ablation needle is inserted, which creates heat, targeting the trigeminal ganglion or the nerve. Another procedure is the percutaneous balloon compression of the trigeminal ganglion. It's an alternative approach performed under general anesthesia that results in similar rates of short and long-term pain relief and is also commonly complicated by ipsilateral facial numbness. So a variety of diseases can affect the trigeminal nerve, which is shown in this table. So most patients present with sensory loss on the face or with weakness of the jaw muscles. Yeah, let's proceed to facial weakness. So the seventh cranial nerve or your facial nerve supplies all the muscles concerned with facial expression, as well as the stapedius, stylohyoid, and the posterior belly of the digastric. The sensory component and the parasympathetic component conveys the taste sensation from anterior two-thirds of the tongue, cutaneous impulses from the anterior wall of the external auditory canal, and the preganglionic parasympathetic signals to the pterygopalatine and submaxillary ganglia, stimulating lacrimation, rhinorrhea, and salivation, while the motor nucleus lies anterior and lateral to the abducens nucleus. So after leaving the pons, the seventh cranial nerve or the facial nerve enters the internal auditory meatus with the acoustic nerve, and it continues its course on its own bony channel and the facial canal, and it exits from the skull via the stylomastoid foramen. It then passes through the parotid gland and subdivides to supply the facial muscles. So Bell's palsy, it is the most common form of facial paralysis, with annual incidence of 25 per 100,000 or 1 in 60 persons in a lifetime. In acute Bell's palsy, there is inflammation of the facial nerve with mononuclear cells consistent with an infectious or an immune cause. Herpes simplex virus type 1 DNA was frequently detected in the endoneural fluid and the posterior auricular muscle, suggesting that a reactivation of this virus in the geniculate ganglion may be responsible for most cases, while reactivation of varicella zoster virus is associated in up to one-third of cases and may represent the second most frequent cause. So the onset is fairly abrupt, with maximal weakness being attained by 48 hours as a general rule. The pain behind the ear may precede the paralysis for a day or two. Taste sensation may be lost unilaterally, and hyperacusis may be present. And a complete interruption of the facial nerve at the stylomastoid foramen paralyzes all the muscles of the facial expression. So the patient presents with the corner of the mouth droops, as you can see in the picture. The crease and the skin fold are effaced, and the forehead is unfurrowed, and the eyelids will not close. So which do you think is the side where there is Bell's palsy for this patient? Is it the left side or the right side?
Right side, doc.
Okay, that's correct. It's the right side of the face because the mouth is drooping, the crease in the skin folds in his forehead is also is effaced now, and the eyelids will not close. So upon attempted closure of the lids, the eyes on the paralyzed side rolls upward. So this is known as your Bell's phenomenon. And the lower lid sags and falls away from the conjunctiva, permitting tears to spill over the cheek. And food also collects between the teeth and lips, and the saliva may dribble from the corner of the mouth. And remember that the taste is intact in patients with Bell's palsy. So if the lesion is in the middle ear portion, the taste is lost. So depending on where the lesion is located, if it is located here in the middle ear portion, the taste is lost over the anterior two-thirds of the tongue on the same side. Okay, and if the nerve to the stapedius is interrupted, there is hyperacusis or sensitivity to loud sounds. And if the lesion is in the internal auditory meatus, they may affect the adjacent auditory and vestibular nerves, causing deafness, tinnitus, or dizziness. So we have anomalous regeneration. So anomalous regeneration of the seventh nerve fibers may result in other troublesome phenomena. So if the fibers originally connected with the orbicularis oculi comes to innervate the orbicularis oris, so closure of the lids may cause a retraction of the mouth, termed as synkinesis. And if the fiber originally connected with the muscles of the face later innervates the lacrimal gland, an anomalous tearing may occur with any activity of the facial muscle, such as eating. So this is called crocodile tears. So when a patient eats, they may cry. And another facial synkinesia is triggered by jaw opening, causing closure of the eyelids on the side of the facial palsy. So this is called jaw winking. So upon opening the jaw, the patient winks. So there are many other causes of acute facial palsy that must be considered in the differential diagnosis. So Lyme disease can cause unilateral or bilateral facial palsy. Ramsay-Hunt syndrome, caused by the reactivation of herpes zoster, is in the geniculate ganglion, consists of severe facial palsy associated with a vesicular eruption in the external auditory canal and sometimes in the pharynx. In sarcoidosis and GBS or Guillain-Barré syndrome, facial palsy is often bilateral. In leprosy, they also frequently involve the facial nerve, and facial neuropathy may also occur in the connective tissue diseases. Acoustic neuromas frequently involve the facial nerve by local compression, and in FARCs, demyelinating lesions of MS and tumors are the common pontine lesions that interrupt the facial nerve fibers. So diagnosis can usually be made clinically in patients with typical presentation, no risk factors or pre-existing symptoms for other causes of facial paralysis, absence of cutaneous lesion of herpes zoster, known as the Ramsay-Hunt syndrome, and there's normal neurologic examination with exception of the facial nerve. So in atypical or uncertain cases, ESR or your erythrocyte stimulating so I forgot the name R for this one, or the CRP, testing for diabetes mellitus, Lyme titer, and chest imaging for possible sarcoidosis. We may also do lumbar puncture for possible GBS. MRI can also be done, which shows swelling and enhancement of the facial nerve in idiopathic Bell's palsy. So the diagnosis may be clinically No need for laboratory or imaging if these are present. So next we have symptomatic treatment. For symptomatic treatment, we may use paper tape to depress the upper eyelid during sleep and prevent corneal drying, artificial tears, and massage of weakened muscle. We may also give a course of glucocorticoids as prednisone 60 to 80 milligrams per day during the first 5 days and taper to the next 5 days to modestly shorten the recovery period and improves functional outcome. Although large and well-controlled randomized trials found no added benefits for antiviral agents, valacyclovir or acyclovir may be given. So other motor disorders of the face. So if the peripheral facial paralysis has existed for some time and the recovery of motor function is incomplete, a continuous diffuse contraction of the facial muscle appears, and facial spasm initiated by movements of the face may develop, called as your hemifacial spasm. So this is a painless, irregular, involuntary contraction on one side of the face. Other than being a sequelae to Bell's palsy, this can also be related to a vascular compression of the exiting facial nerve in the pons and can also be secondary to a demyelinating nerve disease or tumor. Local injections of botulinum toxin into the affected muscles can relieve the spasm for 3 to 4 months, and the injections can also be repeated every 3 to 4 months. And refractory cases due to the vascular compression usually respond to a surgical decompression of the facial nerve. Next, we have your blepharospasm. It is an involuntary recurrent spasm of both eyelids that usually occurs in elderly persons as an isolated phenomenon or with varying degrees of spasm of other facial muscles. So severe persistent cases can be treated by local injection of your Botox into the orbicularis oculi. Next, we have your facial myokemia, which refers to a fine rippling activity of the facial muscles. This may be caused by MS, or this follows GBS, or your Guillain-Barré syndrome. Now let's go to the other cranial nerve disorders. So for glossopharyngeal neuralgia, so this form of neuralgia involves the ninth and sometimes the portion of the 10th or the vagus nerve. So it resembles trigeminal neuralgia in many respects, but it is most common. Pain is intense and paroxysmal. It originates on one side of the throat, approximately in the tonsillar fossa. In some cases, the pain is localized in the ear or may radiate from the throat to the ear because of the involvement of the tympanic branch of the glossopharyngeal nerve. So spasms may be initiated by swallowing or coughing, and there is no demonstrable motor or sensory deficit. It can also result from vascular compression, MS, or tumor, but many cases are idiopathic. So medical therapy is similar to that of the trigeminal neuralgia, which we can give carbamazepine as the first choice. And if drug therapy is unsuccessful, surgical decompression, as mentioned earlier, and we can also do rhizotomy of the glossopharyngeal and vagal fibers in the jugular bulb. Next, we have dysphagia and dysphonia. Sorry. Okay. So when the intracranial portions of the one vagus nerve or your 10th cranial nerve is interrupted, the soft palate droops ipsilaterally and does not rise in phonation. There is loss of gag reflex on the affected side as well as of the curtain movement of the lateral walls of the pharynx, whereby the facial pillars move medially as the palate rises in saying ah, just like in a curtain moving to the side. So the voice is forced and slightly nasal, and the vocal cord lies immobile midway between the abduction and adduction. The vagus nerve may be involved at the meningeal level by neoplastic and infectious processes, and within the medulla by tumors and vascular lesions and motor neuron diseases. The nerve may be involved by infection with varicella zoster virus, and injury to the vagus nerve in the carotid sheath can occur with carotid dissection or following an arterectomy. The 11th cranial nerve or your spinal accessory nerve is a pure motor nerve arising from the nucleus ambiguus and the ventral horn of the spinal cord from C1 to C6. So it innervates the ipsilateral sternocleidomastoid and trapezius muscles. The isolated involvement of the accessory nerve can occur anywhere along its route, resulting in partial or complete paralysis of the sternocleidomastoid and trapezius muscles. Hypoglossal or the 12th cranial nerve supplies the ipsilateral muscle of the tongue, and lesions of the basal meninges and occipital bones may compress the nerve in its extramedullary course or in the hypoglossal canal. So nerve lesion causes the tongue to deviate towards the ipsilateral side during protrusion due to ipsilateral genoglossal weakness. In addition to the weakness of tongue movement towards the affected side, atrophy and fasciculation of the tongue develops weeks to months after interruption of the nerve. So for multiple cranial nerve palsies, several cranial nerves may be affected by this disease processes, as what you can see from this table. So in this situation, the main clinical problem is to determine whether the lesion lies within the brainstem or outside the brainstem. Just read to the table. Okay, let's proceed. So in primary lesions within the brainstem, we have extramedullary and intramedullary. Extramedullary lesion is more likely to cause bone erosion or enlargement of the foramens of exit of the cranial nerve, while the intramedullary lesions often produces a cross-sensory or motor paralysis with cranial nerve signs on one side of the body and tract signs on the opposite side. Involvement of the multiple cranial nerves outside the brainstem is frequently the result of trauma, localized infections, including varicella zoster virus, infectious and non-infectious causes of meningitis, granulomatous diseases such as granulomatosis with polyangiitis, Becquet syndrome, vascular disorders, including those associated with diabetes, enlarging aneurysm, or locally infiltrating tumors. So lastly, let's talk about your cavernous sinus syndrome. So this is a distinctive and frequently life-threatening disorder, which often presents as orbital pain or facial pain with orbital swelling and chemosis, fever, oculomotor neuropathy affecting the third, fourth, and sixth cranial nerves, and trigeminal neuropathy affecting the ophthalmic and occasionally the maxillary divisions of the trigeminal nerve. So this is a case with cavernous sinus syndrome. Cavernous sinus thrombosis is often secondary to infection from the orbital cellulitis or caused by your Staphylococcus aureus, cutaneous source of the face, or sinusitis, especially your mucormycosis in diabetic patients. Other causes include aneurysm of the carotid artery and carotid cavernous fistula, meningioma, nasopharyngeal carcinoma, other tumors, or an idiopathic granulomatous disorder, or known as your Tolosa-Hunt syndrome. So the two cavernous sinuses directly communicate via the intercavernous channels, Thus, involvement on one side may extend to become bilateral. So management. In infectious cases, prompt administration of broad-spectrum antibiotics, drainage of any abscess cavities, and identification of the offending organisms. We also do anticoagulation therapy. They may benefit for primary thrombosis. And a dramatic improvement in pain is usually evident within a few days of oral prednisone, 60 milligrams daily for 2 weeks, then gradually tapered over a month or longer. Occasionally, immunosuppressive medication such as azathioprine or methotrexate needs to be added to maintain an initial response to the steroids. So, and repair or occlusion of the carotid artery may be required for treatment of fistulas or aneurysm. Tapia syndrome is the paralysis of the vagus and the hypoglossal nerve, which can rarely follow endotracheal intubation and has been reported during COVID-19 pandemic. Symptoms consist of dysphonia and tongue deviation, usually resolves within a few months. So here are your recall questions. Can anyone answer these questions? So what are the branches of the trigeminal nerve? What are the branches of the trigeminal nerve?
Doc, we answer po orally.
Yeah, answer orally
Okay.
lang.
Katong V1, V2, V3 po, Doc, ang ophthalmic, mandibular, and maxillary.
Okay. How about for the second question? What is the most frequently detected virus in the endoneural fluid and the posterior auricular muscles in patients with Bell's palsy?
Doc, is it HSV1?
HSV1 or your herpes simplex virus type 1, which is why we also give antiviral therapy to your patients, even though they don't have any symptoms of these viruses. Next question. A distinctive and frequently life-threatening disorder causing orbital or facial pain, orbital swelling and chemosis, fever, and oculomotor neuropathy, affecting the third, fourth, and sixth cranial nerve.
Cavernous sinus syndrome, Doc.
Okay, it's correct. Okay, so thank you, everyone. That ends my discussion for this afternoon.
Thank you, Doc.
Thank you, Doc.
Thank you.
Thank you po, Doc.
Salamat, Doc.
Thank you, Doc.